Hey everyone, it's Samuel.
And I'm Holly.
And welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons.
Today in the Prime Material, how to handle disabilities well in TTRPGs.
In the wilds, the wyvern.
And in the Tavern, what would you do if a dungeon wasn't what you thought it was?
Well, thank you very much for joining me, Holly.
You are more than welcome. It's good to be here.
Yeah, excited to have you on to discuss a very important subject. For those of you out there who are unfamiliar with the work of Tartan Manatee, if you'd like to just introduce yourself and where you can be found online and anything you wanted to share.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Holly. I go by Tartan Manatee. You can find me on Twitter at Manatee Tartan. And I'm a D&D writer. I have been working with Samuel on Disaster Hamsters. I've also worked with Samuel on a different project, which is coming out soon. Big woo. Very excited. And I am a disabled D&D player. I used to be a teacher before I became disabled. So a big love of reading, big love of English. That was my subject as a teacher. And now I'm using those skills as best I can to be a better D&D player, a better DM, and a better Dungeons & Dragons writer.
And you just recently went into streaming a little bit as well.
I did a little bit. It's kind of dropped off at the moment, but I need to get back into that. You can also find me on Twitch, under Tartan Manatee there as well, but there's not much there yet. But there will be more. There will be more.
Well, we're excited to have you on. Before we get into the Prime Material and discussing handling disabilities well, just some announcements to get out of the way. First of all, it is our 50th episode. So we just wanted to thank all of you out there in the Plot Hooks family for supporting us through these 50 episodes and even more episodes of Plot Hooks Adventures and all of our written content and stuff like that. Thank you all so very much. Yeah, here's to 50 and 100 more. We'll be excited to keep going. And remember, if you haven't connected with us on social media, where we can interact and talk even further than just listening to the show, you can find us at Plot Hooks on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And wherever you happen to be listening to the podcast, be sure to give it a rating and a review. It helps push the podcast into more and more people's podcast feeds, just as suggestions. So just take a minute to give that a rating or review wherever you happen to download the podcast. We'd also appreciate it if you could support us on Patreon. If the show has given you something and you'd like to give back, Patreon is a great thing which just helps creators be able to keep the lights on, not just us, but many TTRPG and other creators get a lot of support via that wonderful site. There's lots of awesome perks up there. And there's going to be a lot of little hints coming out soon about Disaster Hamsters on Patreon. Previews for the upcoming DM's Guild release.
So exciting.
Yes, so pumped. But thank you all again so much for your support. So many of you have done all of these things already. So just thank you all for doing them for 50 episodes. We really appreciate it. And like I said before, here's to 50 more. But with all those announcements out of the way, let's dive into the Prime Material. Handling disabilities well. Ableism is one of the big problems that we have right now in the TTRPG space. Over the last year or so, we've seen that crop up to an even greater degree, especially around things like the combat wheelchair, which was put out there by Mustang's Art on Twitter. Lots of inappropriate backlash to that, of course, and it's provoked a lot of discussion regarding disabilities in TTRPGs. And there are, of course, many people who are mean or hurtful in this arena, but I also think there's a lot of unintentional problems too. I know I have tried to really up my disability representation and how I handle it in my games, but I've noticed in hindsight, as I've looked back at the way that stories have played out, that I just haven't always done it well. And so I wanted to have you on as someone who could speak very closely to this discussion, to be able to kind of talk about how we can handle this well in our games.
Sure, I think it's a really important conversation to have, and I think before I say anything else, acknowledging that maybe it hasn't always been done well, but that you are actively trying. I think that is something that is really important to acknowledge and be proud of, because a lot of people aren't prepared to even make the effort to try. So that is great that you're making the effort. Disability representation, seeing ourselves, as it were, in TTRPGs means a lot to disabled people, myself included in that. I started playing D&D proper shortly after I became disabled, and being able to, certainly more recently, see more of myself in my characters and in games has meant an awful lot. It has meant a lot, and it's great to know that the conversation is opening up and becoming more of a factor across the community. It's making a real difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that gets into the heart of why it matters. You know, we see how much it means to those who don't see that type of representation in not just TTRPGs, but just in popular media. So often, disabilities are seen as making a person less than, and often the way that it's handled in, again, both TTRPGs and media is it all has to do with that inherent premise. Okay, so if this person is less than, then this story arc then is about them overcoming that. If this person is less than, then they have to get this in order to become normal. If this person is less than, and it's just everything is based off of that inherent incorrect, just clear about that inherent wrong premise. And seeing quality disabled characters, people that are in your fantasy settings, which are not just there as a half person, is key. Because even without thinking about it, we've treated those with disabilities like less than people in the way that we've handled it. And there's a lot of people out there, you know, myself included, who have not done that intentionally necessarily. But I know that looking back on some of the way that I've handled different things in my own stories, I know that's the inherent message that was behind it, you know, and that's something which needs to be corrected.
I absolutely agree. I think a lot of it, as you said, it's not just across TTRPGs, but it's across wider media. And, you know, you can go one step further. It is a worldwide societal concern. And I think part of it is this idea that disabled people are considered wrongly, but considered less than.
Mm-hmm.
And what people forget about disability is that disability is the great unifier. You know, you can be white, you can be a person of color, you can be gay, you can be straight, you can be trans, you can be old, young, it doesn't matter. At any point in your life, you can become disabled.
Mm-hmm.
And especially now with the current climate of the pandemic and everything, we are going to see a rise in people who have disabilities because of COVID. And so this representation is more important than ever, because we are going to have a larger disabled population. And whilst it's a shame that that is happening and that is why we're going to see this bigger drive,
Mm-hmm.
it does make a big difference. And I think that it's going to challenge a lot of people's perceptions, especially this idea of a disabled person or a disabled character in a TTRPG getting better. That's a really big misconception that a lot of abled people have, is that, oh, well, if you're disabled, you must want to get better. So, well, whilst to a degree you can certainly argue that, there are days when I certainly wish that I could change the way my body works. I also I struggled for a very long time to accept who I am, but this is who I am. This is how my body works. And there is nothing inherently wrong with that. I am not less than other people because I use a wheelchair.
Exactly.
For example. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we're trying to change at the moment, is this idea that we can bring disabled characters into a TTRPG, but then their sole purpose will be to go on a redemption arc almost, or a healing arc. So
sure,
don't need to be. If everyone could be healed by magic or the will of the gods in TTRPGs, you'd never have a disabled person, and that's not how this works. We have a right to be there, whether it's in TTRPGs, in wider mainstream media, or across the board in society. We have a right to exist as we are.
Yeah.
And we have a right to be represented as we are.
Absolutely. You hit on one of the things that people who are abled kind of touch on is sort of what I call the regeneration argument. There's that spell in Dungeons and Dragons called regeneration that essentially allows you to regrow a limb that's cut off. And I mean, nothing inherently wrong with that spell. That could be interesting in terms of a storyline where, you can have a little bit of higher stakes, like you're fighting against the big bad and your paladin gets their arm cut off and, the cleric regrows it. Nothing inherently wrong with that spell. But then what people do is they turn around and say, okay, well, if spells like this exist, if there are spells like regeneration and greater restoration and different things like this, then why would anyone still be disabled? The problem with that argument is, again, you're going back to the point where the person is inherently less than. Because what you're saying is if you're saying that, why doesn't that person just get healed? A, that is a very high level magic and people are in normal life are not going to have access to it. And B, if that is your premise, then what you're saying is that the person needs to be changed in order to become valid. You're saying that the person needs to become fully abled in your perception in order to become a person. You're saying that they're not good enough until they've had that regeneration or greater restoration cast on them. And that's just not the case.
No, definitely. And I think that's, as you said, for a start, if that's the case, then there would, other than, people who maybe don't have access to such high-level magics or don't have the money to afford such high-level magics, other than those people, disabled people wouldn't exist within fantasy settings because they would be fixed, as it were. I hate to use that word, but that's what it would be considered. It would be considered being fixed. But that's the point. Why does someone need to be fixed? And that's where the ableism comes in. And in all honesty, a lot of that is internalized ableism a lot of the time. A lot of disabled people, myself included, have gone through the struggle against our own internalized ableism. Oh, well, I'm disabled now, I'm broken, I need to get better. Or if I can't get better, I'm therefore less than I used to be. And it's a really big struggle. It's a really hard thing to deal with, especially if you're someone who becomes disabled later, perhaps, than someone who is born with disabilities. But I think that that's one of the big arguments to be had, big discussions to be had, is that disabled people don't necessarily need to be fixed. And that brings us into the other idea of that. You mentioned like a paladin having their arm lopped off mid-combat and the cleric regrowing it. That's absolutely fine. But there's going to be a big difference between a paladin who's gone through that and can immediately be fixed and someone who is perhaps born without an arm. And I think that's where we look at how the mechanics of the game work as well. There are some really great blogs by Writing Alchemy where they've talked about the mechanics of the game and how they can limit disabled people. And we need to differentiate between how mechanics affect characters who are legitimately disabled, and that is going to become a part of their character. Either they've been born that way and become adventurers later, or they have experienced something that has caused their disability and the player makes the decision to see that through. And someone who is under the effects of a spell, for example. One of the examples that Writing Alchemy mentions is PCs who have temporarily lost sight, for example, due to deafness or blindness spells. We use the same mechanics for that we do for someone who is born deaf or blind. But a deaf or blind person who has been disabled for a substantial amount of time has learned to deal with that. They have learned they've adapted. And to punish someone who is playing a blind or deaf character as their character by using the same mechanics as someone who is under the temporary effects of a spell is actually really unfair. Because they aren't going to, and that's one of the things that I think is so fantastic about Mustang's art, Sarah Thompson's combat wheelchair, is that it doesn't overcompensate, but it does provide sensible adaptations. At no point are people who use the combat wheelchair overpowered or OP'd, but they have reasonable adaptations that a person in a wheelchair in the real world would have to an extent. Obviously, they're not going to have things that allow them to levitate or grow, or for the wheelchair to have mechanical spider arms that can cross difficult terrain. But we have adapted.
Sure.
Wheelchairs now are better constructed than they were 10, 20 years ago. They have suspensions, they have mechanics that allow them to go faster without being pushed or requiring manual pushing, because we adapt. And mechanics is a really big part of that. And I think that if ableism and representation of disabled people is going to be something that we make a priority going forward, we need to go right the way back to the mechanics of the game. And we need to look at how the mechanics affect people. We need to look at how we deal with that in two separate spheres. There need to be mechanics for people who are under the effects of spells or temporary conditions. And there need to be mechanics that are written to suit people with disabilities, characters with disabilities, because otherwise you are punishing the people with disabilities for being disabled. And we get enough of that as it is outside of the game.
Absolutely.
Everyone who plays D&D, we play D&D to escape. That doesn't mean we don't want to see ourselves represented. That doesn't mean we want to escape every aspect of our own personal lives. But it would be nice if we could see ourselves and our characters without continually being punished for being ourselves.
Sure. I think it was Sarah who mentioned something about, it might have been someone else, I'm not sure. I remember seeing on Twitter somebody mentioning about the idea of removing conditions like blind and stuff like that and changing it to just a disorientation. Like that way you can have an effect that a boss can inflict on a party mid-battle in terms of disorienting them and giving them disadvantage on certain rolls, but not say that, oh, this effect is there because you cannot see. And then inherently having that connect with somebody that cannot see because they've been blind from birth.
Absolutely. And I think it comes down to even further, it comes down to disabilities that are invisible disabilities as well. The wording of a lot of conditions can be inherently ableist. There are games which feature things like insanity scores. Statistically, the most common disability worldwide in the under 60 population is depression, followed closely by hearing or visual impairments. So the largest population of disabled people are going to have depression or some form of mental illness. And we're seeing that being almost weaponized in a way in the game. I'm sure that at no point has it been meant to be like that. It's not been written to be an attack on people. But when you're going through something like depression or other forms of mental illness, it can be really quite hurtful, especially when, again, rightly or wrongly, you're with people who don't maybe understand all the ramifications of that. And you have to sit there and watch your friends making fun of people who are, oh, you're completely insane, you are. It can be really hurtful. And I think that we have to go back and we have to do a lot of work. Not just us as players, but the creators of games like Dungeons and Dragons. It goes back to them, and the only way that those changes are going to be made is if more people stand up and say, this isn't okay. We want to see the changes. We want to see representation done properly. It can't all come from independent creators or players like Sarah Thompson, like yourself, like me, like other players. It has to come from the bigger names too, because they're the ones with the clout to make it more common and mainstream.
Sure.
But it is happening, slowly but surely. It's not enough. It's not moving fast enough, but it is happening. And it's great that we are seeing more representation across the game. I know that very recently Sarah's combat wheelchair was featured in an episode of Critical Role. Matthew Mercer used the combat wheelchair for one of his NPCs, and that is fantastic. Sarah is also now has an official character in Idle Champions, Talon, the tiefling rogue, using a combat wheelchair. So the representation is beginning. The next Wizards of the Coast sourcebook, Candlekeep Mysteries, has a dungeon written by Jennifer Kretschmer that is an accessible dungeon. And that is fantastic. It's unfortunate that the backlash has been so vitriolic. It has been really unkind and cruel. But those voices are becoming weaker as more and more people are saying, well, no, we want to see this. We want to get that in there. And I think that's really important. And I'm really glad that it is happening. It just needs to happen more.
Absolutely. So in terms of actually taking all of these concepts and putting it to work in our actual games, you mentioned there a lot of the mechanics stuff, and we can do a lot of minor things like that within our own games, even like the things that we come up with in terms of creators. I had a thing that I came out with on my Patreon. It was in October. It was something to do with what I called mental fortitude. It was designed to work in terms of horror games, but I was having difficulty coming up with the term for whenever you failed. Like, in traditional mechanics, it's called madness, which runs into the same, issues as what you were talking about with insanity. I went with a different thing, but then somebody pointed out to me, a problem with that particular language as well. Ultimately, what I ended up on was something called delirium. Even just in terms of the language of mechanics and stuff like that, nothing really changed with exactly how it worked. It's a mechanic which, determines how you're able to act or if you're able to have any disadvantages if you're just scared out of your wits. Just coming up with language which was appropriate for that and not just using I'm insane was something that was important in order to make sure that we're representing disability as well. So that's one aspect that we could take it in terms of our games. In terms of, storytelling and actually playing things, a lot of disabilities that we're going to encounter is in terms of just our characters that have disabilities, whether that's the dungeon master putting NPCs in the world or with characters that we create ourselves. And so there's some issues that we can run into whenever we do this, which we need to make sure that we get right if we're going to handle disabilities well. One problem that we often have is we make a villain or a character or some other NPC whose story arc, whose sole purpose is overcoming that disability. And we mentioned that a little bit, earlier as we were in the middle of our conversation. That's not a good story arc, because that story arc inherently is going back to the point of this person is less than, and they want to overcome their less thanness through the course of the story arc. And that is something that is not treating them as a whole person up front. There is a way of having somebody just be disabled and be a character, having that disability be a part of who they are, but not something that needs to be fixed.
Definitely. And I think one of the most interesting threads that I read last year on Twitter was, again, Mustang Art Sarah Thompson, her thread on The Witcher, the character of Geralt of Rivia, and also her thread on Darth Maul from Star Wars, and how these characters are disabled.
Mm-hmm.
But the one specifically about Darth Maul is he is a disabled villain. However, that is not why he is a villain.
Yes.
That is not why he goes on this massive revenge quest to take down Obi-Wan. He's not angry that Obi-Wan disabled him as such. He's angry that he was defeated by a Padawan, and he wants to prove that he is better than that. And actually, he overcomes a lot of what he's going through very well, but not in a way that, I've gotten myself better. He adapts. He builds himself mechanical legs.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't go on a quest to have them grown back or to have part of his body restored. He adapts with what he has. And I think that that's a really important part of it. But I think that having a villain or a main character whose sole purpose is to overcome that disability, it's actually quite lazy.
That's true.
As well as being really reductive. It's just lazy, because if every person who ever became disabled or was born disabled or is disabled for whatever reason was a villain, the world would be overrun by villains. We don't all want to be fixed or overcome. And I think that's the thing. It's this idea of overcoming. It's not something to be overcome. It is something that we live with every day, and we just do. Mm-hmm. We just deal with it. I remember when I first learned that I was neurodivergent, I was in a school event. I was listening to someone talking about how I have lots of students who suffer with neurodivergence. And I remember my dad getting really angry, and my dad making a point of writing into the school the next day and saying, my child doesn't suffer with this. This is who she is. It is not something that she suffers with. It's not something she overcomes. She's one of your best students. And your language takes that away from her. Your use of the word suffer takes that away from her. And I think that this idea of having to overcome a disability takes away from the fact that disabled people deal with and manage their disabilities extremely well for the most part. We all have really bad days. I'm not going to lie and say we don't. We all have days where we sit there going, God, I wish this could be different, because it's painful for a lot of us. It's hard. It's never ever going to be easy. But at the same time, it's who we are and it's the way we are. And I don't want to punish anyone for my disability. I don't want revenge on anyone for being like this. And I think that there are far more interesting and engaging reasons to be a villain or to be an interesting main character than just, I want to go and take down the dragon that bit my arm off.
Yeah.
Okay, that dragon, it's one of those, like, okay, the dragon bit your arm off, and that's a real shame. But that dragon is also committing, mass homicide across the continent that you're playing in. That's a bit of a bigger concern than just your arm. Or a villain who has fought your heroes before, and in the last fight that you had against him happened to be thrown off a cliff and has, become paralyzed from the waist down, has lost the use of this. Well, you were fighting them before. Have their motivations changed that much? If you were fighting them before, they would have been a villain then. So what was their motivation? Why does that have to change just because they've become disabled? I just think that you can be so much more interesting and engaging, and that's why characters like Darth Maul are such interesting characters, because they are so much more than just, oh, well, I'm disabled and I'm angry about it, so I'm going to punish people.
Sure.
He wants to be what he thought he was going to be. He wants to be this Sith master, essentially. And then when you start to look more into his backstory, because he has so much more to his backstory than just was a Sith apprentice, got his butt handed to him by Obi-Wan, and then, was found with his mechanical spider legs and went on and was later killed by Obi-Wan. You can look back and you can see how he was chosen and taken from his people and lied to about his potential and what he was going to be. And that's what makes him angry. It's not he's disabled. It's everything that came before and after that makes him such a great villain. And it's a fantastic example of very non-lazy writing. And if you as a DM or as a player just go, oh, well, my character's disabled, so they're really angry all the time, it's lazy, it's reductive, and it's rather insulting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think as well, it brings us to this idea that every person who is disabled must inherently hate their disability.
Yeah, that's another issue we can run into. Yeah, whenever we're creating a character, there's, we do that oftentimes where that's the way we interact with them too, as we're interacting with them as an NPC, as that we're controlling as DMs, or as player characters when we're interacting with a NPC that the DM has created that is disabled. We interact with somebody by focusing on that disability and assuming that they hate their disability, and again we're limiting them, and that just ought not be the case.
No. Absolutely. And I think this idea that every character that is disabled must hate being disabled is definitely a hold from the wider issue that is how people consider disability in real life. Disabled people are often called inspirational because they're living with their disabilities. So why? Why is it inspirational? I'm just living my life as best I can, but isn't that what you do? As an able person, aren't you living your life as best you can with what you have? That's exactly what I'm doing. It's not inspirational, it's just getting through the next day. And I think this idea that if you're disabled, you must hate being disabled, or you must hate yourself or that part of yourself is a really poisonous idea. And bringing that into a character or an NPC does nothing but perpetuate that ideal. It does nothing to help anyone learn about what it's like to be a disabled person. And the worst part about that is there are so many people that you could ask.
Yes.
There is such a large percentage of the TTRPG community that is going to have a disability in some form or another, whether that is a physical disability, whether that is neurodivergence, whether that is a mental illness. Like we said, depression, for example, is the most common disability in the under 60s population across the globe. These things are prevalent in our society. So talk to somebody. Ask them. It might feel awkward, but you can ask sensitively. You can open up these conversations. And actually, as a disabled person myself, I certainly can't speak for other people, but for myself, if someone was to come and say to me, hey, can I ask you, how have you found dealing with this aspect of your disability? I would really welcome that chance to have that conversation, because it indicates a willingness to learn and to do better. Sure. And that's all we really want, is for people to see us as we are, which is a human being who's just in a wheelchair, or reads Braille, or uses a guide dog. or any of those things. And they are all things that can be easily translated across to TTRPGs. They are all things that you can make use of. There's a really great moment in Dimension 20, which is DM'd by Brennan Lee Mulligan, where his NPC is talking to one of the characters about a panic attack she's having, about anxiety that she's having, and telling her that it is absolutely okay. It is not a moral failing. It is not a problem that she needs to feel bad for. And he does it in a very funny way, a very jokey way that could come across as a little bit insensitive when he turns around and offers, as an NPC, offers the character anxiety medication. It's like, you're going to take these and then you're going to get up and you're going to go out and you're going to face the world. You're going to face this monster and you're going to take it on. But it is not a problem to take the medication. It is not a problem to need that help. It is not something you need to be ashamed of. And I remember watching that for the first time thinking, this is fantastic. This is exactly how it should be, because it is not a moral failing to need support. It is not a moral failing or a sign of weakness that you need medication to help control a chemical imbalance in your brain that you absolutely can't control. And it was great. It was a really good piece of representation and accessibility, because he was giving his character the opportunity to access something to help manage a condition. So it shows that it absolutely can be done. The combat wheelchair has shown it absolutely can be done. It's just whether or not people are prepared to take the time to integrate those features into their own games. And if you're not, you have to ask yourself, why not?
Well, we certainly hope that each one of you were able to take a little bit away from this particular conversation, and that you are able to integrate a little bit better just with some of these things, the disability representation into your TTRPG storytelling, and be able to make sure that, you know, we handle disabilities well, and in a way that just reveres those who have disabilities as, again, full people, and make sure that we don't fall into any of these traps which, you know, sees them as less than. But this is a really important conversation to have, and obviously we can't touch nearly everything in the midst of just a 30-minute conversation. But again, like Holly said, you know, just be active in actually trying to continue to learn. I know I still have to be that way. I know I don't have everything down, and I learn things even in this conversation. And I am always seeking to learn on how I can do this particular aspect better. And I hope we all can as well. But with the prime material behind us, I think it's time we head out into the wilds and into the skies to look at your favorite monster.
Yeah, let's talk some wyverns.
All right, we're out here in the wilds. Today, wyverns. So these are your favorite creature. What do you love about them?
I absolutely love wyverns because they're a great way of getting your party fighting something like a dragon that isn't not considered a full dragon. And I think the best thing about them is it makes the party feel like they're fighting something big, but that at lower levels they are able to take on.
Sure.
And wyverns can be really, really versatile, and they're great as well for adapting a little bit from what you see in the monster manual. They just are really, really versatile, and I think they're really good fun.
Yeah, and that's, you know, what makes a great creature, which is very useful for our storytelling efforts, is that versatility. And they certainly are that. They are classified as large creatures in Dungeons & Dragons. They look kind of like a dragon, only they have a couple of different features. Namely, the one that is most prominent is the stinger that they have on the back of their tail, which is a big part of their character, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. The other is the fact that they don't have front legs, and historically, that's actually the difference between wyverns and dragons. There's a lot of cultures and places which make no distinction between the two. They're just essentially two words for the same thing, if I'm not mistaken. But in the 1500s in Britain, they kind of diverged into wyverns having their front arms being their wings, and dragons having front legs and wings. And that is the big difference that holds true in D&D as well, as you see the dragons having 4 legs and wings, whereas the wyverns have their 2 back legs, and then their arms are attached to their wings, just like a bat. And that is a definitely a difference between the two in terms of just what they look like. But in the grand scheme of things, they're small, stinging dragons.
They are, absolutely. And I think it's one of those things, I think the distinction between wyverns and dragons outside of D&D specifically is one that, as you said, it doesn't really get noticed very often. If you look at, for example, Game of Thrones, the dragons in Game of Thrones are, if you look at them, wyverns.
Yep. Same with Skyrim. Wyvern-born, hasn't the...
Yeah, it doesn't sound quite the same. I mean, I think it sounds really cool, but they're not too keen on it. The dragon from The Hobbit, Smaug, they are depicted in more recent media as wyvern-style dragons. But I just think they're really interesting, and I think they're also, where they're unaligned as well, you open up the potential for, well, this could be a pet, which I know that my players are very fond of obtaining creatures as pets.
And that's one of the big things that you can use them with, is they actually have the capability of being tamed and being ridden. I know that's a little bit more classic. That's not an original thought by us, of course. There's lots of campaigns which use wyvern riders as a particular force in one of their cities, but that is something that you could certainly do. And they're also much more easily raised if they're raised from being little, and having the party come across a wyvern hatchling could be a really interesting kind of kink to throw in a story if they're just happen to be traveling around in an area where these things subsist.
Definitely. I know that most recently in my campaign, I already had other plans for giving my party a creature, so I avoided that when it came to the wyverns, but they did come across a nest. So they are higher levels, so they came across a nest where I had nerfed the stats of 3 of the wyverns, so that they weren't newborn hatchlings, but they were sort of adolescent wyverns. And then once they had defeated those, oh dear, here comes Mummy, who had full stats and a couple of little homebrew features. But I think, again, that's one of the best parts about wyverns, is that you can adapt them really easily. You can nerf them, you can upgrade them if you like, and it just works really, really well. I think they were a little bit disappointed they couldn't keep one as a pet, but they ended up with a phoenix, so it's fine.
There are a couple aspects of their lore which I find really interesting in terms of using them. One is the way that they will corner their prey. If they're chasing your party, especially if they're lower level, like levels maybe 3, 4, because these are a challenge rating of 6, if they're struggling to beat the wyvern and they're running around trying to find a place to hide, well, if the thing that they're chasing hides in a place that the wyvern can't follow, they will guard the entrance. They will just kind of sit there and stalk and just try to lash out with their stinger into the place, and that could create a really interesting dynamic if your party just happens to hide in a cave, and now this wyvern is just sitting out there in front of the cave entrance trying to get to them, and they have to figure out a way around, or try to chisel through the rock somewhere, or fight their way out, or figure out a way to actually get away from this thing, because it's not just going to leave on its own.
Yeah, definitely. I think while the book certainly states that they're not as intelligent as dragons, for example, they do still have a lot of that patience, and they
Mm-hmm.
definitely have that hunting instinct. And as far as they're concerned, you're food, or
Mm-hmm.
you've attacked them. And they can sit there as long as it's going to take. And I think, especially as you mentioned the stinger, that is one of the most interesting parts, is that the idea of, oh, well, we have a cave, we can hide in here. So it's not going to be that simple. You can really ramp up the danger for a party. And I think that adds so much to encounters that you don't get with some other monsters in D&D and other TTRPGs. I think that works really well as having that, oh, we've escaped. Oh, no, you haven't. I think that makes it really interesting.
Absolutely. That stinger can actually draw them into a story too, because they're a great fetch quest, because the poison which is inside of that particular stinger is something that's quite valuable for certain kinds of alchemy and certain reagents. And so that is definitely something that a alchemist could send the party on a quest to get. And if you're just looking at, especially again at lower levels, to give them a fetch quest to tide them over to the next level or whatever, then fighting a wyvern would be a great thing to have. That stinger attack, as far as getting into the actual mechanics, is an attack that is reach of 10 feet with +7 to hit. It only deals 11 piercing damage, 2d6 plus 4, but again, just a massive amount of damage from that stinger. If you miss your DC 15 Constitution saving throw, you take 76 poison damage and half as much on a success. That is an astronomical amount of damage for an attack, and it can do that along with a bite attack each round. I mean, that is just a fascinating ability for a CR6 monster, and just the visual of it too, just this giant flying thing whipping its tail around, and it usually doesn't attack on the ground either. It's almost always flying. It does not feel safe on the ground, so while it can certainly attack on the ground if you're talking about encountering them in a cave or in a forest or something like that, they are oftentimes just going to be in the air around the party, swooping back and forth, whacking them with their stinger that has a reach of 10 feet. And so if none of the party has a reach attack, then they're never even getting in range for opportunity attacks. And it creates a really interesting combat encounter of just wyverns swooping over their heads, which can be something that's really interesting for the party to have to deal with.
Absolutely. And I think especially if you're then encountering a group of wyverns, potentially with riders as well, with mounted riders, you have the potential to do a lot of damage per combat round. There is so much you can do with that. I think going back to it being like sending them on fetch quests, I know that in some old RPGs like Baldur's Gate, for example, there are magical weapons you find. One of them I think is called Stinger, and it is a wyvern's sting. So the possibilities of the things you can do for fetch quests, whether it's just getting the poison, getting scales, getting bits and pieces, or even having something like the Stinger fashioned into a weapon, can be really, really interesting. And yeah, I think the visual as well of just that stinger, almost scorpion-like, sort of lashing around, is just a really fantastic one. Quite intimidating as a player to hear about.
Yeah, they're awesome creatures, and if you haven't had the opportunity, I would certainly recommend trying to throw one of them into a game. Again, even if it's just for a combat encounter, there's lots of things about them which make them really fascinating, and you can tell great stories with them.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that's about enough time out here in the wilds. Let's head over to wrap up the show at the Tavern and get some refreshment. All right, we're closing things out by heading over to the Tavern. So, what would you do if a dungeon wasn't what you thought it was? This harkens back to The Empire Strikes Back. I was searching through a plot hook generator, just coming up with ideas for this whenever I got it, and The plot hook generator came out with like 3 simple words. It was like dungeon chases you. And I was like, well, that's weird. And then I just started thinking about it. And then I started thinking about The Empire Strikes Back, where the Millennium Falcon is fleeing from the Empire, going into the asteroid field and going into a cave when it's actually an exogorth, which is a giant space slug, essentially feeding off of the minerals in the rock and making itself look like a cave so that it can gobble up people that come near it as well. That is a fascinating aspect. Like, what if you were going through a dungeon crawl and there's just little hints as you're going through these little elements that maybe this dungeon isn't what it seems, and it turns out that you're actually going through the interior of a creature, not actually going through a dungeon itself. That's a really fascinating angle.
I really love this angle, and actually it's something that I've seen not in a TTRPG, but in one of the very first Discworld books by Terry Pratchett. When the characters seek refuge in what they assume to be a cave, they light a little fire and everything seems to be fine until they realize that there is wind coming from the back of the cave, and that shouldn't be happening. But it's a very rhythmic wind. And then they investigate a little bit and find that they have set up camp in the mouth of a troll. Trolls on the Discworld are made of rock, and they get bigger as they get older. And this is a very old troll who has gone almost dormant in its old age, has just settled down and become a part of the landscape.
Wow.
So much so that it looks like a cave. And they have to try and get out of this thing's mouth before it basically just wakes up and swallows them. So it's a concept that I've seen it before, and I think it's fantastic. It's something that I've been trying to think about how I can work something a little bit like this into my own campaign. And I think it's that slow build that's the really key part. It's that build up to realizing, oh, I'm not where I thought I was. This is so much worse. And I think it's such a great concept.
Yeah. Depending on exactly what creature you decide that they're in, you can reveal it slowly in different ways. One of the things you could do with this is with a variant of an astral dreadnought, who, if you are eaten by an astral dreadnought, you go essentially into this demi-plane, which you can't escape out of under normal circumstances without a plane shift spell. So of course you have to be very careful as far as what you're doing this to a party if you're actually wanting them to actually ever get out of there. So you have to be really careful about doing it with a low level party. But with some sort of variant of that, because whenever an astral dreadnought eats something, what it eats, it doesn't really go away. So you can go into the room of this, air quotes, dungeon, and you see maybe some aspects of one civilization, and you're like, oh, okay, I'm in this ancient ruin of, insert this city from the past here. And then they go into what looks like the next room, and now all of a sudden they start seeing a couple of other strange relics. And now maybe a couple rooms down the line, now they see something from a much more recent civilization, and they're like, okay, what's going on here? I see, and now slowly it's revealed that they're seeing things from all different time frames that this creature has just eaten. And depending on what you're actually inside, again, you can kind of use that slow burn in different ways to just slowly reveal that, oh, this is not what I thought it was. Maybe I shouldn't be trying to investigate every room and get every last bit of treasure, because I am turning into the treasure if I am not careful.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that you mentioned, Empire Strike Back. I mentioned Terry Pratchett's Discworld. It's something that definitely is used across a lot of fantasy and sci-fi media. Again, Doctor Who is a really good example. With the 11th Doctor, Matt Smith, when they go to, they find that they're on the back of a star whale, and they end up in its stomach as prisoners. That's where prisoners are sent, and they realize that they're not in a prison; they're actually in its stomach, or its mouth. And it's that realization that I'm being eaten. This is something's stomach juices, and I'm being digested. It's really interesting. The potentials for having your party sort of. Can you just roll me a constitution check? And they was like, yeah, you start to feel like a bit of a burn. Why? Why would I feel a burn? figure it out. There's a lot of potential there, and I think because, especially things like Dungeons and Dragons, you have so many different planes and so many different places. It's so easy for players to just assume that that's what's happened, is that I'm on a different plane, I'm in a prison somewhere. And so taking that expectation and completely subverting it by having them be inside something is really good fun as the DM to watch that oh moment. It's a really great moment to have, and I think it adds so much fun and roleplay, both for the players but for the DM as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you didn't want to make it an actual creature, you could theoretically just have this be a possessed dungeon. I like the idea of connecting this to a powerful artifact. You sort of get this in one of the quests in Skyrim, coincidentally, which we mentioned earlier, whenever you're in Markarth, and you have that abandoned house, which is kind of essentially possessed by Molag Bal because his mace is there, and you can have a powerful artifact which the party is even there to fetch. But once they're there, you suddenly begin to realize that this dungeon itself is sinister, that maybe even the rooms seem to be moving, that things are happening here which don't make sense, and you slowly begin to realize, again, that slow burn, that this dungeon itself is maybe a little bit more sentient than you gave it credit for.
Yeah, and you definitely see that in written modules such as Curse of Strahd, for example. That's one of the first things that players can encounter in Curse of Strahd is a very similar scenario, where you go into the house and you can't escape, and you start to realize that the house is reacting to things, the house is doing things, and it's really creepy. You know, as a player, it's a really creepy experience to realize that the environment is fighting you too. And I think it's a really fantastic way of drawing players in and forcing them to think about how they react to everything, not just, well, there's the monster, let's deal with that. Okay, you've got a monster you've got to deal with, perhaps, but you might also have to deal with a house that doesn't want you being there and is carnivorous. For what there's so many different ways you could do it, and I think it's absolutely opens up so much potential for creativity, both as a DM and as players as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that'll just about wrap up this 50th episode of Plot Hooks. Thank you very much for joining me, Holly. If you'd like to shout out once again where people can find you on social media so that they can connect with you.
Sure. So you can find me on Twitter under @ManateeTartan. You can also find me on Twitch for the occasional stream under Tartan Manatee, as that's what I go by, Tartan Manatee. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful to come on and have this discussion with you about something that for me is so important, both as a disabled person and as a Dungeons & Dragons TTRPG player. So thank you very much.
Sure. No, absolutely. And thank you all out there for listening to this awesome and very important episode. More so than normal, check us out on social media and interact with us on there and discuss about this particular topic. This is an important one to have conversations on. So make sure that you head over there and engage if that tickles your fancy. But for now, about time for us to say goodbye. Thanks very much out there again for listening. And thanks from all of us here. I'm Samuel. Thanks from Holly and the rest of the Plot Hooks team. Matt, Steve, Dave, Zach, Mike, Becca, and of course, podcast Pupper Ellie. We'll see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.